Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff, with co-host Eleanor Goldfield. Today on the program, we welcome back regular guest and contributor Kevin Gosztola. He's author of Guilty of Journalism, the Political Case Against Julian Assange, with a foreword by Abby Martin. Kevin Gosztola is also the curator of the Dissenter newsletter, among many other things that Kevin does. And of course, the Project Censored universe is very familiar with Kevin's work because we have him on the program regularly giving us updates regarding the case of Julian Assange, who is still in prison, in Belmarsh Prison in the UK. But there have been some recent developments, and I just want to make sure everybody knows that it is Thursday, May 23rd, because the world doesn't stop for us to take its temperature, and these are pre-recorded, and the program airs the following week, so we just want to make sure that people know when Kevin and I spoke. Kevin, welcome back to the Project Censored Show.
Hey, it's good to talk with you again.
Absolutely. And Kevin, there have been some updates. There's been some development on the case of Julian Assange, and you were going to write about these things, but there are some other interesting things that happened that intervened, and we're going to be talking about your colleague Mohammed El-Mazi, who wrote for The Dissenter. U.S. effort to extradite Assange hits roadblock as a British High Court grants appeal. Sounds like some decent news for a change. Kevin Gosztola.
Yeah, so typically I would be the one reporting, and I've done everything that I could to cover on proceedings. These hearings in London, I would say, present a whole range of issues for independent journalists. It's expensive, it's cumbersome, it's resource intensive to try and get yourself there. It's a one-day hearing. And so it is my belief that international journalists shouldn't have to travel thousands upon thousands of miles around the world to get to these hearings when it is an international case of importance, a high-profile case that the courts recognize as of importance, and especially when it has stakes for the countries of Australia and the United States. I would say that anybody in those countries should be able to have access to proceedings. However, the High Court of Justice in London has taken a position abruptly in the last few months and for the last two hearings that if you are not located in England or Wales at the time of the hearing, you do not get to access proceedings through a video link. And you do not get access to a video link with your press credentials, because if you are not in those jurisdictions, the court doesn't have the ability to enforce the rules against you. They can't stop you, they can't jail you or hold you in contempt if you take a screenshot or you record audio or video in violation of the court rules. So you just aren't going to get access unless you can get yourself to England or Wales, which means that I no longer can follow these proceedings remotely, the way that dozens upon dozens of international journalists were doing before. I know that's not really the issue we want to spend the entire broadcast or conversation discussing, but it is an important one because I want people to just recognize that it's not lost on me that in a case where this is of high importance for journalists, you basically have the court saying that their default position is going to be that journalists present a threat to the security of the court. That as they are targeting a journalist, Julian Assange, and trying to extradite him and bring him to the U.S. for a trial, any journalist that covers these proceedings, it'll just be presumed that if the court didn't have the ability to jail you and threaten you with penalties, you probably wouldn't obey their rules. And it's just absolute nonsense that they can't enforce the court rules. If I did something that the court did not approve, they could just never grant me credentials again to proceedings. And they could also say that I never get to cover a single case beyond Julian Assange's case. And since I cover global press freedom cases, I don't want that to happen. So I don't need to prove to anyone that I follow the rules, but it's absolute ridiculousness that they think that they can't enforce their court orders. So I hired Mohammed El-Mazi. I'm glad that he's able to come on and continue the Dissenter's indispensable coverage. And people who were donors and also subscribers of the newsletter stepped up and helped me raise a bunch of money so that we could pay him well for doing this work. And I'm glad to be able to share his reporting with you and just very basically say that he was able to report on the first positive decision in a long time for Julian Assange. There's a lot of optimism in the Assange camp as of May 20th because of the fact that the US government now finds themselves in this position where they have to unravel this mess that they created through their lead prosecutor, Gordon Kromberg, who said that Julian Assange would likely be denied access to any First Amendment protections if he was put on trial. And what the High Court of Justice hears is that perhaps his rights to freedom of expression won't be upheld, and that is a reason to bar extradition to the United States.
So, Kevin, that sounds like extraordinary news, good news, or positive news around the Assange case, which has just had one bad news or blow after another, going back to 2021, right when the extradition was paused. I mean, not for positive reasons. Again, around mental health issues. I mean, the whole case is a travesty of justice all around, as you and I have talked about many times. But I'm optimistic that this might be a way of preventing the extradition. And so just the whole story you told about how you can't cover it, how they're preventing other people from covering it. I mean, that's been going on for quite a while. People not having access, right, to Julian Assange. So this is an ongoing concern.
Yeah. Rebecca Vincent contributed
Yes.
to your State of the Free Press book and tells a whole story about Reporters Without Borders not being given a seat. And what she had to do is stand in line with Assange supporters. Assange supporters have been tremendous and helping those who want to sit in the public gallery and don't have credentials. They'll hold your position in line for hours upon hours in the queue. And then you don't have to wait overnight from like 3 to 10 o'clock in the morning, like you're trying to get a Black Friday deal. And so that's good. And I think what's important about this development is that it is an opening for Julian Assange to potentially walk free from jail. We haven't had that in a long time. We've had pressure from Australia that we thought might potentially force the Biden White House and the broader administration to reconsider continuing this case. It just hasn't happened. They haven't backed down. But now with the High Court of Justice essentially saying, we think there's a real possibility that Julian Assange will be prejudiced on the basis of his nationality at trial. That is a huge deal. And again, how they get to that point before we move on to other topics is to say that Julian Assange is an Australian. Mm-hmm. And if you look at case law, this is even something that like the Supreme Court has decided. They say if you do not have ties to the United States or if you are a foreign national, that you do not have First Amendment rights necessarily for your speech. That is to say that you can be prosecuted and you can't claim First Amendment protections as a defense against those criminal charges. And so you see that the prosecutors, this is what Mohammed reported on, they had to get twisted in pretzel knots to try to convince the High Court that they were wrong to ask the U.S. government to provide a promise to protect Julian Assange's First Amendment rights. They made up this idea that citizenship is somehow different from nationality and that these aren't the same things. And it was just, trying to confuse everyone with legal jargon. That was not accepted by the High Court of Justice. And so eventually they just arrived at the obvious juncture where it was, we have to grant an appeal hearing. This is a serious matter. And so coming up probably in the summertime, Julian Assange's legal team will enter a court and they will argue out the First Amendment question. And it is a very narrow appeal. This court rejected several grounds of appeal already. There are huge issues. There are tremendous issues with this case that the High Court of Justice is ignoring. So don't get me wrong. I'm not giving the High Court of Justice too much credit and saying that they are now on Julian Assange's side, and I'm not saying that they aren't going to help the US government get out of the mess in which the US government finds themselves. But this is a dilemma of their own making, and the easiest way for them to unravel it is to just drop the charges and not pursue Julian Assange's extradition any longer. It's what so many reputable organizations have demanded, and yet they insist on going through this in endangering press freedom around the world.
So Kevin Gosztola, Julian Assange's wife and counsel, Stella Assange, said from the article, "We spent a long time hearing the United States putting lipstick on a pig, but the judges did not buy it." And then you mentioned Rebecca Vincent earlier. Reporters Without Borders International Campaigns Director Rebecca Vincent called today's result, quote, "an important milestone," end quote, which opens up, quote, "a vital new path to prevent extradition." So just again, building on what you said, there are very positive things connected to the most recent developments.
Yeah, and it's a technicality, but oftentimes that's how these cases resolve themselves. You don't have courts recognizing that Julian Assange is a journalist and this is wrong for press freedom, but you do have judges along the line saying, "Oh, well, he has these mental health issues, and the U.S. government hasn't shown that its prison system would prevent him from committing suicide. So we need to block this extradition." And then there were a whole set of appeals, and the U.S. found a way out. And then now we're here on another technicality, and they're saying, well, it looks like you have some rights for freedom of expression for U.S. citizens, and then you give foreign nationals another set of rights for freedom of expression. And we think it should be uniform because to end this topic, the European Convention on Human Rights has what is known as Article 10. It covers freedom of expression, and it is not an article that has a citizenship requirement. Any human being, it's for human rights, any human being has universal human rights.
And that's a striking argument, and I think a profound one. And look, we can go back to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights in Article 19. There's global precedent for this kind of to protect freedom. And your work, Kevin, I know we're going to talk more about press freedom and other whistleblower cases and some things coming up. But again, this is a pinnacle case, and to see these developments just in the past week, after we've just seen nothing but a raft of things, not just going against Assange, but as you again always point out, the absurdity of the courts not being concerned about press freedom. There's a weird technicality that we need to get into the weeds about, but protecting press freedom, protecting whistleblowers, protecting journalists, protecting publishers, protecting sources, nah, not so much. Seems very backward to me, Kevin.
Yeah, and then these prosecutors who stand before the court and actually raise even further alarm. James Lewis is the lead prosecutor, and he stood before the court and he said, "Oh, okay, it doesn't matter whether Julian Assange is a foreign national. If he was a U.S. citizen, it would still be illegal what he did. The U.S. government would go after U.S. citizens for publishing illegally obtained classified information that," and then they add this caveat of that, exposed confidential sources to harm. But the fact is that that's not the status quo within the United States. The news media and the US government for the longest time has had this unspoken understanding that they get to publish any information that they obtain. If there's going to be any prosecutions, it's the sources that get prosecuted. Those are the whistleblowers or the leakers, however you want to refer to them. But journalists have been off limits. And if you look at the history of the Espionage Act, the people who were threatened they never had criminal charges brought against them. So like James Bamford, who's done a lot of work on the NSA, Seymour Hersh, Beacon Press was threatened. Their staff or their management was threatened by the Nixon administration because they wanted to put out a book with the Pentagon Papers. But there were never any prosecutions.
Kevin, we're going to now segue into and of course we can still bring up issues around Assange or the case, but we wanted to focus a little bit of time today too. May 3rd was World Press Freedom Day, and I know we're coming up on the end of May now, but I think every day should be World Press Freedom Day. So we'll go ahead and pretend that that's the case. Kevin, what else is happening? What are some other key developments? Look, there's been a lot of things we've been talking about on the show about the crackdown of media, of reports, whether it's social media or journalists on the ground, or literally killing of journalists in Gaza. So we've been talking a lot about Israel, Gaza, and I know you have some things to say about this. The AP, the Associated Press, recently had materials taken by Israel. We know that Israel has recently banned Al Jazeera. And also, speaking of the Press Freedom Index, right, the United States slid to 55th globally in terms of press freedom, and Israel is now at 101. So, Kevin Gosztola, weigh in.
Yeah, I'd like to just bring up what happened over the last week. And that is, in the last week, we saw, as you just said there, that the Associated Press had their equipment seized by the Israeli government because the government says you are sharing your footage from a live shot of northern Gaza with Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera, the Arab news network, which has had its journalists basically assassinated in Gaza. They've been targeted by the Israeli government, was banned under a media censorship law that was passed on April 1st by the Knesset.
No fooling. I mean, goodness.
It gives Benjamin Netanyahu and his government this broad authority to designate any media organization operating in Israel as a national security threat. And if they are designated a national security threat, they're banned for 45 days. Every 45 days, they can review it, and then they can resume the ban. They can renew the ban. And so it now is very clear, as these press freedom organizations had warned, like Reporters Without Borders, the National Press Club in DC has actually been fairly principled on this matter. Committee to Protect Journalists, what they have said is that it's not going to stop with Al Jazeera. They can go after any news media organization that is broadcasting images and sharing content about the truth of what's happening in the war on Gaza, and ensure that those images and that reporting does not reach. They don't want this kind of information to reach the Israeli people. I mean, fundamentally what this is, it's an enforced media blackout for the Israeli people so that they can continue what they're doing in Gaza. And this is all part of the censorship regime, where they are blocking international journalists from going into Gaza. So you're only allowed to embed with the Israeli military forces. If you would like to go cover any of the death and destruction, you must do it through the eyes of the Israeli military. And so this is all part of that. But the reason why it's part of my focus as the resident Assange expert is because the U.S. did end up contacting the Israeli government to say, give the Associated Press back their equipment. And they did this in less than 24 hours. And the Israeli government listened. They have not taken this kind of action to get the Israeli government to reverse their ban on Al Jazeera. And the U.S. government has their own history of targeting and going after Al Jazeera. And in fact, a documentary that is marking its 20th anniversary that I recommend is called The Control Room.
Yes.
That shows this, what was going on during the Iraq War, the second Iraq War. And so it just shows you, though, that the U.S. government truly determines and has the power to set what global press freedom is and to prevent threats to global press freedom. So if they don't want Israel to attack journalists, they could do a lot more to stop it. If they don't want censorship, they could do a lot more. If they didn't want Julian Assange to be extradited, they could do a lot more.
Well, Kevin Gosztola, we know they're not going to do a lot more because it just doesn't go along with the imperial agenda.
No.
And I mean, where did Israel get the ideas to do some of the things that they might be doing? I mean, take a look at what happened in this country after 9/11. You mentioned Control Room, the great documentary that juxtaposes these two different newsrooms, Western and Al Jazeera, right? And it's an interesting film. If people, I won't do spoilers, but if people haven't seen it, it's timely as ever. I'm glad you brought it up. But look, after 9/11, we were hardly beacons of press freedom, beacons of protecting civil liberties, beacons of following international law. The United States has just run roughshod over all of those principles. And so we can't be surprised when we see allies and other proxies, whether it's Israel or elsewhere, doing these similar things, and then obviously doing them with impunity. And we can see that it's, the Israeli government, the Netanyahu government in particular, whenever Joe Biden or somebody over here, like even has a pause, it's almost like their necks whip around and they're just like, what? Like, did you say something? Because there's no real precedent, except when we see these little tiny snippets of like, you could have done something, you could have done something. But the overall historical record shows that the U.S. isn't going to do something. And if they do, it's probably going to not be great. It's not going to be to advance sovereignty. It's not going to be to advance press freedoms. So, and this is really big right now, riffing on the press freedom issue. We've been talking about congressional efforts to give unilateral authority to the Secretary of Treasury to revoke nonprofit status. I mean, look, if you ask me, I think that they're really ramping up the ways in which that they can censor and deplatform. The whole TikTok ban we found out between Anthony Blinken and Mitt Romney was about Gaza, was about information on TikTok. I mean, they came out and said it. They said it out loud that they're trying to deplatform it because it's owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance, and they can't really control the platform, which means they're also tacitly admitting that they have control over the ones here that aren't really any different. Kevin Gosztola.
Right. And the reauthorization of Section 702 under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act amendments, which President Barack Obama voted for after he said he was against it and that he wasn't going to support retroactive immunity for warrantless wiretapping. That we find from Mike Turner, the Republican. He openly said that they were going to need to continue this authority because they want to figure out like if Hamas or Hezbollah or any of these other Islamist militant groups are behind these protesters that are on campuses. They use that as the excuse or the justification for not letting it lapse. And they continued, and actually they ended up expanding the authority because now they can force other entities to become government spies. They added a data center requirement that allows them to rope in more people to serve the total surveillance function of the NSA and other U.S. agencies.
So these are not positive developments for press freedom. These are not positive developments for transparency. Kevin Gosztola, where can we push back, and what do you, with your experience, and I know the good work that you do, what are some things that we might be able to do? And can you also please mention what just happened in Australia so we can see that attacks against leakers, whistleblowers, and by proxy attacks on the press, they are ramping up, not just in Israel, but we just saw in Australia.
Yeah, very quickly, as you were making the point, the U.S. sets the agenda, they set the tone, and client states, allies, people who work with the U.S., they take notes and they learn from the United States. And in some cases, what we see happen in a country like Australia is probably being directed and encouraged by the US government. So they they sent a whistleblower from the Australia military who exposed war crimes in Afghanistan by Australia soldiers. They sent him to jail for 5 years. He was sentenced. His name is David McBride. He actually exposed this information to the Australia Broadcasting Corporation, which was raided by Australian police in a very alarming kind of draconian act. And so this is a huge attack on press freedom. The Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance of Australia is a union of which Julian Assange is a part. They wholly condemned what has unfolded. And so as I sit here, sometimes it sounds like I'm giving credit to Australia for standing up for Julian Assange, and I am. That shouldn't delude people into thinking that I believe that Australia is doing great when it comes to freedom of the press and upholding whistleblower protections. They aren't. There are actually multiple whistleblowers who are facing trials in Australia right now and could go to jail. So what we need to do to push back, what we can do to push back, is to continue to take a stand and engage with this kind of reporting and news media coverage, to make it an issue and to raise it if you have any opportunities to interact with people who are in positions of power, whether they're in Congress or part of the executive branch, to let them know that you do care about this as much as any of the other issues that are regularly spoken about on the Project Censored Show. Because I think sometimes they think that, the average citizen doesn't really care about freedom of the press. What does it matter? I mean, it's not like it affects their pocketbook. They can, there are other things that are more important to people. And I think people truly do care. I think it is offensive what the U.S. does, because they hold themselves out as a kind of supporter, a beacon to the free world, human rights and democracy. And then they're doing this, and they're encouraging a clampdown on freedom of expression.
Kevin Gosztola, author of Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange, curator of the dissented.org. Thank you as ever and always for joining us on the Project Censored Show today. We will have you back on in the near future. Thanks for joining us, Kevin.